Australia is a nation with so much potential. Sprawling lands, amazing resources, and a great geographic position. Yet, we hear nothing about them, except for their role in keeping the Chinese industry running. Australia, despite all of their advantages, lacks one thing most of all: people. Australia is extremely sparsely populated, about as big as the US mainland, but only holding 8% of their population, and that after very solid population growth the past few decades. If we look at the historical record, it becomes very clear why Australia never left the shadow of their Anglo brethren. Tiny Britain has 3 times their population. Now you may think, oh, but this is because most of Australia is uninhabitable. This is partially true for the interior, but Australia is still in the top 10 nations with arable land, having the highest arable land to population ratio. Clearly, Australia could have supported a lot more people, even without resorting to extreme terraforming. Obviously, Australia could have ended up stronger, but how? Well, there are limits to what we can do to help Australia. If we start too early or fundamentally change the continent to make it more green, this will then also butterfly away most of their history. Changing these fundamentals almost certainly butterflies away Australia as we know it, either by changing the culture and civilization of the Aboriginals, or by risking a scramble for Australia by multiple colonial powers. Beyond that, in this scenario, I don't want to explore plans to dig massive canals across the nation to turn it into a paradise. This is for 2 simple reasons. First, any such canal digging projects cost way more than reasonable. I've seen estimates that a canal across Australia might cost $150 trillion. That's 90 times Australia's GDP. While likely exaggerated, point is, it's gonna be very expensive, and scientists generally agree that plans like these wouldn't work in the short term. Letting the salty ocean run through Australia doesn't immediately make it more arable until it comes coupled with increased rainfall, which would take decades, if not centuries, to actually start having a serious effect. So, if we don't start there, then where do we start? Well, a single man might make all of the difference. James Mario Matra. He had been a British loyalist in the 13 colonies, deeply saddened by the Empire's loss, thereafter returning to Britain. He joined Captain James Cook on his Pacific explorations and became fascinated with the region, specifically with Australia and New Zealand, urging London to colonize those lands. Matra's plan was to recreate the former 13 colonies in the Pacific, and the plan for the colony was simple. Let's reach out to loyalists remaining in the US and Canada and move them to Australia. In our timeline, Matra's proposal for settling Australia was indeed accepted, but instead the focus came to lie on Australia as a prison colony, with borderline slave conditions for the early settlers, and Australia would receive its infamous reputation as a nation founded by criminals. Should Matra's proposal have been accepted, it is unlikely many loyalists would actually move there. After all, why not just go to Canada instead, or even move back to Britain? But, aside from any increase in early settlers being great, it's more important that we change the reputation of the colony, away from a nation of criminals, towards a better version of the former 13 colonies. In our timeline, from 1788 to 1828, the first 40 years of Australian settlement, about 50,000 people moved to Australia, nearly all convicts. All the way up to 1840, convicts held the majority in Australia. Beyond discouraging other, freer forms of immigration, this also meant that up to World War I, there were significantly more men than women in Australia. These 2 factors greatly depressed Australia's early population, which, through the power of compounding, makes a huge impact in the long term. But of course, there are other reasons for Brits not to move to Australia in the same numbers as they once did to the USA. For one, the journey was just far longer. For another, the British had been colonizing America for far longer, meaning you were moving to a functioning society rather than a society you would have to build up yourself. Still, getting more immigrants and hopefully more women at this early point will hopefully help create a better functioning Australia with far more people in the long term. Another point is that Australia's early history was troubled. The leadership had little respect for the prisoner population, and we saw the officer class ruthlessly exploit the population for personal gain. Governor John Hunter attempted to restore order, but failed to do so. This was another factor which hurt the early development of Australia. And once again, perhaps James Matra could have helped here. If we install him as governor instead, with his more utopian, free vision of Australia, we might prevent some of this abuse and corruption and set up for a stronger foundation, the new land of opportunity. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with all the latest releases, consider doing so. Thank you. Then we must discuss a dark chapter of Australian history, their treatment of the native population. Australia, without a doubt, were some of the worst offenders in this regard, going way further than just the mindset of the time. Their official policies were brutal, targeted abuse and repression, continued well into the modern era, the effects still being felt to this day, being underrepresented in the economy and society at large, while being overrepresented in things like crime statistics. Their treatment was so bad that until the 1960s, Aboriginals weren't even counted as humans in the Australian census. Sadly, there also isn't an easy fix for this. We can't just magically take the racism out of Australia. Beyond that, the two big issues the Aboriginals would struggle with were that the indigenous Australians weren't one people. There were at least 800 distinct groups. Beyond that, Australia is really big, so the natives struggled to throw up a large and organized enough resistance to force some recognition of their rights. Still, we might at least hope to reduce their plight. Governor Burke, for example, made it law in our history that all natives were simply forbidden from owning land, which obviously made any attempt at economic prosperity in this era impossible. Even if we assume we can't just cut them altogether, we should hope to severely limit these laws. Perhaps by admitting land ownership on the basis of language, offering at least some way for Aboriginal integration into the nation. Of course, this would still amount to forcing them to give up their culture to integrate into Australia, but the hope is that by altering laws like this, we open the door for a more long-term path to civil rights for the natives of the region. I really wish I could realistically do a lot more, but the problem is that Australia and New Zealand were captured by the ideals of social Darwinism. Simply put, the white British settlers didn't have that much initial sympathy for the population group they denigrated as not even human. Then I want to discuss the actual establishment of Australia in 1901. Before this point, the region was divided into 7 British colonies, often grouped together with New Zealand and Fiji as the Australasian colonies. Yet, upon Australia's founding, New Zealand and Fiji did not join the Federation. You might have heard this was because of New Zealand's Treaty of Waitangi, which they claimed led to a better treatment of the natives of the islands. Joining Australia, they feared, might erode such rights for the natives, so they remained out. Sadly, this is New Zealander fantasy. While less so than in Australia, the Maori people were still deeply mistreated. Most of their land was still seized by the British colonial government, 2/3 of their population still died, and settlers enjoyed immense privileges over the natives. Even more, Australia was aware of New Zealander sensitivities. So when proposing federalization, they specified that native rights were to be an issue for the individual states. So, if New Zealand wanted to respect their native population within an Australasian federation, they could. In fact, Australia recognized the Maori peoples as, well, people, giving them voting rights while their own Aboriginal population didn't. Clearly, native rights weren't the main issue here. So then, what was New Zealand exceptionalism. You might not expect it from New Zealand, but they had some interesting ideologies leading them. Richard Seddon, the Premier of New Zealand, didn't want to join Australia because he had a different plan for the future of the nation. New Zealand, in his mind, was going to form a union of Pacific islands, becoming to them what Britain was to New Zealand. With such grandiose ambitions, he feared that Australia wouldn't follow a similar foreign policy. Beyond that, there was a surprising bit of racism. All of New Zealand had the same climate as Britain. Climate, at the time, considered ideal for white people specifically. A real idea maintained at the time by some people was that over time, the warmer, more tropical climate of Australia would dilute the pureness of the Australian white population. Another issue considered was Chinese immigration to Australia, which New Zealand feared would spread to them as well. Then a final significant motivation for New Zealand remaining separate was the economy. It might seem odd, but the invention of refrigerated shipping might have dealt a crippling blow to New Zealander integration into Australia. Why? Because a key reason for Australian unification was the unification of the colonial economies. New Zealand, though, ever since the 1880s, extensively used refrigerated shipping to trade with Europe, and therefore their economy was far more disconnected from Australia. Economically speaking, New Zealand just didn't have a reason to join. So those were the political and economic considerations that most of all led to New Zealand remaining a separate nation. But even Britain itself had wanted New Zealand to just join the Australian Commonwealth. So perhaps, if we move up the timeline just a slight bit, having Australia federalised earlier in the 1870s or 1880s, at around the same time that their sister nation of Canada did, New Zealand might have been persuaded, or forced, to just join Australia. But is federation at this time realistic? Well, I think it is. Australia's population has grown much faster than historically, and therefore there may be earlier calls for political independence and federation. To better govern these larger territories, Britain would historically create a Governor-General overseeing all Australasian colonies. Again, this included New Zealand and Fiji too, increasing their ties to Australia. Somewhere in the 1870s, Australia federalizes, including all of British Australasia. Now this period also roughly coincides with the aftermath of the Australian gold rush. Australia is immensely abundant in ground resources, most notably coal, iron, uranium, and indeed gold. This gold rush was essentially the backbone for modern Australia. Starting in 1851, it absolutely exploded the Australian population as well as their economy. Due to us already having increased Australia's population, these gold rushes might occur earlier, and yet more people might come to Australia. To hammer home just how influential this gold was, Australia's GDP rose to become 1.5 times that of the USA. This wealth ensured railroads were developed, cities could grow, and companies were founded. Suddenly, the remote British colony was the fastest growing economy on Earth for a time. By 1900 in our timeline, 3.7 million people lived on Australia. This could easily be increased to 5 to 7 million in this timeline, with a further million living in New Zealand. Now with that setup done, we can finally get to Australian expansion elsewhere. Usually in these videos, I like to focus more on territory rather than economics and demographics, but Australia is unique, by virtue of being founded so late. We really needed this initial century to just set up Australia in the best possible position. But now, they can start looking to the Pacific, with the conquest of at least parts of Papua New Guinea, while to the east, New Zealand in our timeline got all of these islands. Australia gaining them here is quite likely, already setting them up as quite the South Pacific power, potentially leading to Britain considering transferring even more islands to their Pacific dominion. But that already leads us to World War I breaking out in Europe. I hope you're not surprised to learn that Australia, having a few million more people and islands, is unlikely to fundamentally warp world geopolitics all too much. In the same way, Australia doesn't have a radical role to play in the war itself. In the Pacific, much like in our timeline, Australia and New Zealand captured German New Guinea, Nauru and Western Samoa. But if we want to, we could suppose that Japan remains neutral for longer, or joins the war but moves slower, therefore allowing the Australians to occupy the Marshall and Caroline Islands as well, ensuring the British and Australians can prevent Japanese expansion if they wish. This had been an actual war plan by the British, but it historically fell through due to swift action on the side of Japan. Then, within Europe, you might be familiar with Australia's role in the invasion of Gallipoli. This turned out to be a complete disaster, with more than 10,000 dead and 20,000 wounded. Post-war, it has been used as a rallying cry and often is cited as a major cause for Australian nationalism, eventually leading up to Australian independence, as it signified Australian boys dying due to bad British leadership. Yet, what this analysis doesn't take into account is that this wasn't just an Australian operation. Of course, we could easily say Australia doesn't join the Gallipoli campaign, but regardless, Australian and New Zealander boys would nonetheless die in Macedonia, France and the Middle East, just as all other British dominions did. At best, the focal point of Australian nationalism would be moved away from Gallipoli. But Australian nationalism as separate from Britain is still very likely to be cemented in this war. In the peace deal, Australia once more expands, in our timeline gaining northern Papua and Nauru, while West Samoa was taken by New Zealand. But if we want to improve that for Australia, we could argue the Marshall and Caroline Islands are added to Australia too. Though it is not impossible, Japan objects so much that the great powers decide to give them up anyways, or divide them between the two. Yet if we assume Australia gets them, this would leave them one of the most dominant Pacific powers. This is important as we move into World War II, where it would be extreme to suggest this strengthened Australia can go toe-to-toe with the Japanese. Yet, their influence on British Pacific policy could still be felt, as their army, air force and navy would all be more formidable. Even if this doesn't lead to Australia heroically halting the invasion of Singapore alone, this could still have major implications for the Pacific and Asian theater at large. Now, one option for this timeline is for Australia to indeed make the difference in the defense of Singapore. Historically, Britain just didn't really consider it under threat, despite Australian insistence that a plan was needed to defend it. As a response to Australian complaining, Britain simply said they would send a big enough fleet when it was needed. The Australians felt, and were proven right by history, that while they didn't doubt Britain's intention to defend Singapore, the British were overestimating their own power, as it was most likely Singapore would only get attacked at a time when Britain was preoccupied elsewhere. This led to Australia historically not relying on Britain's Singapore plan, instead investing their limited resources into an army and air force strong enough to deter aggression by themselves. Even if we assume the Singapore strategy fails, historically, Australia and New Zealand had about 8.5 million people by this point. In this alternate timeline, it might be somewhere nearer to 15 to 20 million. Australia, if they so choose, could be far more prepared for a conflict, with especially Papua having plenty more air bases and soldiers, but also Japanese Pacific ambitions being more difficult to implement due to Australia's presence there, which would first need to be removed. In case you're wondering, I did consider whether these Australian holdings might prevent Pearl Harbor, but the Japanese route to Hawaii didn't actually cross these islands, so this is not necessarily the case. Now, at a minimum, we could state that Australia succeeds in defending Papua from Japanese aggression. And once the US starts their campaign from the east, Australia is a major player in assisting in the reconquest of Indonesia and the Philippines, before the Japanese are decisively defeated. But in the best case, we could have a situation where the Japanese invasion of the Philippines is made more difficult due to the Australian Pacific, and Japan needs to redirect resources to their capture. It is also possible Australia now has the leverage to convince Britain to invest more in Singaporean defense, with Australia also providing more forces for it. Here, it is important to note that arguably not that much might be needed for the British to hold onto Malaysia for longer. The Japanese didn't necessarily have an overwhelming force in this invasion, except that they had tanks and the Allies didn't. The main problem though is that Britain sought to mainly hold the port of Singapore, while a realistic defensive line would need to include most of Malaysia, or preventing the Japanese landings before they get out of control. The British would thus need to commit to a more aggressive strategy, potentially even preemptively invading Thailand to get a better defensive line on the coast. And all of this might be demanding a bit too much from Australia and a Britain focused on the Germans. Thus, more than likely, even our alternate Australia cannot save Singapore. And even if they could, we'd likely be inviting disaster later, as also halting the simultaneous Japanese invasion of Indonesia would be very difficult to do realistically. After which point, defending Malaysia would become very difficult anyways. Either way, Australia plays a massive role during the entire Pacific War, but still, they are unlikely to actually expand much as a result. At best, gaining some more minor islands from Japan, but even this might be prevented due to America's hegemony post-war. What is more important than some islands though, is that Australia has proven itself once more to be a great power in the Pacific. In the years following, their full independence from Britain becomes a reality, as Britain was completely broke. And amongst their collapsing empire, their interest in the Pacific waned significantly. Even in our timeline, they had hoped to start offloading Pacific islands they no longer wanted to Australia. Historically, Australia declined the transfer of quite a few islands, they themselves not wanting to carry the financial burden either. But the much more powerful, larger, maritime Australia we have created may just accept these transfers, decisively cementing Australia as the lord and master of the southern Pacific. This then finally leads us to Indonesia, a region Australia was deeply interested in. On the one hand, the government supported their right to independence, even being the ones to bring it up to the United Nations. On the other hand though, they considered it a potential threat, Indonesia having about 10 times Australia's population. Perhaps for Australia, their best outcome would be a minor adjustment in their stance, still advocating for Indonesian independence, but taking self-determination further, supporting the independence of various eastern regions. Indonesia is a very diverse place, and during their struggle for independence, the Republican movement was the strongest in the West. Some eastern regions, most notably Western Papua and the Moluccas, were less enthusiastic. The Moluccans had been under Dutch colonial rule the longest, the majority being Christianized by this point. Moluccans were also the population group most utilized in the Dutch colonial army, and during the Independence War, the Dutch had promised them independence. West Papua then was retained by the Dutch until 1963, even in our timeline, when Indonesia took control of it, and ever since then, Western Papua has been fighting for their independence against them. I think it's far from unreasonable for an alternate Australia to simultaneously support Indonesian independence from the Dutch, while also promoting the rights of these eastern regions. Perhaps they conditioned their aid in the UN for Indonesian recognition of those nations, likely initially as Dutch neo-colonial projects, later transitioning into full independence. From there, we will see the decades progress into the Cold War, and Australia would mostly behave as they do in our timeline, as a ruthless economic and military hegemon to the nations around them for their own benefit. For example, upon East Timor's independence, Australia for decades siphoned oil from their national waters for their own profits. Similarly, in regards to the islands of the Pacific, Australia holds outsized diplomatic and economic influence. Australia's relations to the nations around them might be best compared to the US and the Caribbean or Central America. A mix between investments and partnership, as well as ruthless exploitation and political intervention when necessary. During this period, Australia would start releasing some of their territories, like Samoa and Nauru, letting them become independent states. Yet, even today, those islands remain completely dependent on Australia. Similarly, Papua might also receive independence during decolonization. Still, whether directly or indirectly, Australia would still hold influence over by far most of the Pacific. Today, Australia has roughly 27 million people. In this alternate timeline, this could easily be up to 45 to 65 million, with the integration of New Zealand, earlier growth and the compounding effect. This would make it on par with modern nations like Italy, Spain and Britain. Their economy could easily be doubled, placing it anywhere from 4th to 7th in the world. Australia is not just a medium power in the Pacific, it is an active great power, at the forefront of competition with China, a close military and diplomatic ally of America, Britain, Japan, Taiwan and the likes. Even more, Australia has done something only one other British settler colony has done before. They have eclipsed their motherland. For now though, this is the end of the video. Thank you all for watching and consider leaving a like and a comment, as well as subscribing. If you've enjoyed this video, click the video on top to watch another in this series. If you've already seen it, I'm sure the bottom video is great too. Once again, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.